End-to-end testing covers the interaction of classes and modules at a more aggregate level, closer to the kind of interaction that our end users will have with the production system. In previous lessons, we learned how to manage unit tests in our application. Now let's shift our focus to how we can create and structure end-to-end tests for our system. Let's start by opening up the existing app end-to-end spec file located in the test directory to better understand how we can create our own end-to-end tests in the future. As we can see, end-to-end configuration here looks very similar to what we saw in our unit test suites. However, there are a few key differences that we should pay attention to here. We're using the compile method again we used in our unit tests, but for end-to-end tests, we need to use the create nest application method to instantiate an actual nest runtime environment. Instead of saving a reference to a service like we did in our unit tests, here in end-to-end tests, we're saving a reference to the running application in the app variable so we can use it to simulate HTTP requests. Lastly, we need to manually call the init method to initialize our application, which will mount all of our routes, trigger lifecycle hooks, etc. So that's it for the initial setup. Let's look at how an end-to-end test is actually structured. If we look at the it block here, we can see that we're simulating an HTTP request with help from the library supertest and calling the request function provided by it. Supertest is an NPM package that provides a high-level abstraction for testing HTTP applications. We need these HTTP requests to route to our running nest application. This is why the request method needs to be passed a reference to the HTTP listener our nest app is running on, which may be Express or Fastify depending on how we set up our app. This is what app.getHTTPServer is trying to do. The call to request now hands us a wrapped HTTP server connected to our nest application. We now have the ability to chain methods here to simulate an actual HTTP request. In the example shown here, we're using request.get with the string / inside of it. This will initiate a request to our Nest app that is identical to an actual HTTP request coming in over the network. Since we still have that demo app controller on the root level of our application, which in turn replies with the hello world message, this test should succeed. To test it real quick, let's open up the terminal and enter in npm run test:(e2e). As we can see, the test is actually failing, and the error message is expected 200 OK, got 403 forbidden. This is caused by our API key guard mounted globally that we created in a previous lesson on other building blocks by example. Just to remind ourselves, the API key guard requires us to pass a hard-coded API key within a header. Since the root route we're trying to hit here isn't decorated with the public decorator we previously set up, we need to pass this header in the request for the test to pass. We can fix this real quick by opening up VS Code again and chaining a set method to our HTTP request. This method lets us set any headers we might need. So here, we're just going to pass in that authorization and the key we previously set in our env file. Let's save our changes, open up the terminal, and see what Jest gives us now. Perfect. It seems that our end-to-end test succeeded now. However, we can also see that we got a warning. Jest did not exit 1 second after the test run has completed. This warning means that there are some asynchronous operations that weren't terminated in our tests. In this particular case, it's an opened database connection. Back to VS Code again. Let's add the after all hook below all of our tests. This after all hook will be called by the Jest framework after all tests are completed. Here we called app.close, which lets Nest know that it should trigger the onModule destroy and onApplication shutdown lifecycle hooks, which will terminate all connections in our application. For the sake of consistency, Let's also change our before each here to before all, since typically we don't want to recreate the application for each end-to-end test. Just to make sure that everything's working as expected, let's open up the terminal again and run npm run test:/e2e for the last time. Great, as we can see, everything's passed and we have no more errors or warnings. Although we fixed this end-to-end test and it's working properly now, it's still far from perfect. We're importing the app module here, which means that in fact we're instantiating the entire application, including all controllers, providers, enhancers, configurations, establishing database connections, and so on and so forth. Nest modules typically represent features, so ideally we should be able to test these features in isolation independently. In the next lesson, we'll look at how we can test modules in isolation without worrying about other modules that might have been imported into the application.